You're listening to the Diplomat's Asia Geopolitics podcast. I'm your host, Catherine Putz, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And this is Ankit Panda back in Washington, D.C. after a wonderful week in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue, among other things.
How's your jet lag, Ankit?
It's there, but hopefully listeners won't be able to pick up on too much of it. I literally just got back to Washington, to a very smoky Washington, I might add, with the fires up in Canada. But Katie, I think it'll be great to kind of debrief a bit and talk about what happened in Singapore over the weekend.
Yeah, we definitely had to do this now before everyone forgets about Shangri-La, but how could you? I want to start with like the headline item, which from my perspective has been sort of the U.S.-China dynamic. Both U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chinese Defense Minister General Li Shangfu spoke at the dialogue on different days. They did not meet with each other. I'm curious what you made of their remarks as well as that sort of decision not for them to meet. I think the U.S. has been seeking that meeting, and the Chinese have been sort of avoiding it. But perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'll try to provide a bit of color on the podcast from a participant. So I've been going to Shangri-La for now, I guess, 5 consecutive rounds since 2017. And this was the 20th one overall. So I guess I've been to a fourth of all Shangri-Las that have ever happened. And this was the first one that I've been to where the U.S. And Chinese defense ministers didn't meet. And actually, a lot of the
Mm.
buzz before the dialogue began was about the will they, won't they dynamic leading up to this. There were various reports and rumors suggesting that the Biden administration might lift the personal sanctions on General Lee, which were the primary reason that China apparently refused to meet with the United States. Although, in the counterfactual scenario where those sanctions don't exist, it's also imaginable that China might still resist a meeting given just how bad U.S. China relations have gotten. And so by the first night, we began to hear rumors that General Lee and Lloyd Austin would be seated at the same table at the opening dinner, which was the dinner where Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would give his keynote. And they were. And you began to see these photographers kind of coalesce around that table as the two of them shook hands. And that was the big U.S. China breakthrough at Shangri-La this year, right? But, on that note, obviously nobody was too impressed with a handshake. A handshake is not a dialogue, and that's actually almost verbatim a line from Secretary Austin's speech. He talked. I think he said something about that. Handshakes are not enough. Like, we need to have an actual conversation, which didn't get anywhere. But now after Shangri-La, we're seeing reports that Secretary Blinken is going to China. President Biden, before Shangri-La happened, predicted that he was expecting a thaw in U.S.-China relations. That thaw definitely did not happen at Shangri-La, but instead I think we got what I think is likely to be a new normal going forward for many of these international forums, but especially Shangri-La, where the forum is really going to turn into a platform for the U.S. and China to present their respective narratives and visions for Asia to regional states. And I think that's what we saw this year.
One of the things we published this week was from our colleague and fearless leader Shannon Tiezi, who wrote an analysis of Lee's speech. And one of the things that she picked up on was that he made some concrete proposals, mentions of confidence building mechanisms, dialogue, which in her interpretation sound a lot like the quote unquote guardrails that Washington likes to talk a lot about.
Yeah.
But she also said that, he sort of buried these points under these sort of aggressive diatribes against the West, against the United States, without necessarily naming the United States. Do you think that there is space for that dialogue, or when Lee says dialogue, does he mean something that the United States can't agree on? Because it seems it's interesting to be saying almost the same things. Like, of course, we want to talk to the other side, but not actually doing those things. What's the issue?
Yeah, no. So first thing is that this is General Lee's first road show. It's his first international speech. It's certainly his first time taking questions from an international audience. And the other thing is that based on the session title, well, we all sort of knew that he'd be focusing on Xi Jinping's global security initiative, which China rolled out not too long ago. You're right, Katie. I mean, sort of sitting in that room and listening to General Lee's speech, there was a long diatribe against the United States without naming the United States, and eventually he gets to a section on the United States where he begins naming Washington. And there he does offer a little bit of lip service to the relationship between the two countries being too important to completely ignore dialogue. But then we get to the Q&A where he's asked about a near collision in the Taiwan Strait that happened the night before his speech, right? I think it tells you a little bit about the extent to which China might be coordinating from the top down all the way to the operational level, because it seems like a really terrible thing to do right before the Chinese defense minister is about to speak at Shangri-La. But when it comes to that particular issue, which is from the U.S. perspective, the exact thing that demands a conversation on guardrails and demands a conversation on military communications, Lee, I think, gets to the core of his remarks, and a core I think that we've seen in previous speeches from his predecessor, General Wei Fenghe, which is fundamentally that, yes, the U.S. and China can talk, but the U.S. has to recognize that it's not an Asian power, that it has no place in Asia, that it needs to back out and, quote, mind its own business in China's backyard. And that's a non-starter for Washington. So we end up, really back where we started on a lot of this. So the speech, was pretty standard fare, I thought, depending on one's mood. People variously interpreted it as very hawkish or rather par for the course. I thought it was somewhere in the middle. He did come off, I think, as a little bit more hawkish than General Wei did on issues, including, just generally how he talked about the United States. He did talk about Taiwan. He said nothing new on Taiwan. It was all just familiar talking points that we've heard in the past. But he made sure that he hit all of the major points. Again, he's got an audience of one back home with Xi Jinping as well, so he's got to make sure that he's doing the right thing. Just before I pass it back to you, Katie, I mean, one of the things with that's important to recall about General Lee is, yes, he's on the Central Military Commission, but he's not Secretary Austin's counterpart in the truest sense. The Chinese Minister of Defense is more of a military diplomat in the context of a meeting like Shangri-La, especially. He doesn't have oversight in the way that the vice premier of the CMC, General Zhang, does in the Chinese system. And so that is something I think worth keeping in mind. And this is something that's come up recently for the United States, where Secretary Austin has tried to reach out to his notional actual counterpart, not his counterpart in terms of protocol, right? General Lee does have the Minister of Defense title, but his role in the Chinese system can't really be compared directly to what someone like Secretary Austin does in the United States.
That is a great thing to point out. As always, the context matters. Let's move on to the keynote speaker. So this year's keynote was Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. How would you sort of summarize the core message of his keynote speech? And also, since you were there, how was it received in the room?
Yeah, so I think the second part is pretty easy. I don't want to be rude to the Australian Prime Minister, but I think of every Shangri-La I've been to since 2017, this keynote was probably the one that left least of an impression on the rest of the dialogue. In that I heard less about the speech than I did about previous keynotes, like especially Prime Minister Kishida last year, who I think really made a big impression on the dialogue, and several speakers kept coming back to his comments. I think a few ministers did mention Prime Minister Albanese's speech, and we had the Australian Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister there, and several other senior Australian officials. Look, I think Albanese's speech had three core themes, I would say, that stood out to me. One being on the importance of the rules-based order for a country like Australia. Right? Unsurprising, Australia has been a big supporter of U.S. efforts to pursue a free and open Indo-Pacific, to support a rules-based order regionally. So this was a prominent theme for Albanese. Albanese also talked about the role and agency of small states and middle powers, which is a message that's particularly nice to tailor for a forum like Shangri-La, which as we
Hmm.
basically haven't gotten to yet, right? The dialogue takes place in Singapore, and there are many Southeast Asian countries in attendance. In fact, every member state of ASEAN except for Myanmar sent official participation. This year, there were also small island states in Australia's neighborhood also participating. So, for a forum that, as we've just demonstrated on this podcast, can often be subsumed into the U.S.-China dynamic, Albanese made an effort to point out that Asia is home to these other countries that have autonomy, have sovereignty, and have the decision to make their own choices about their defense. And that's where he gets to sort of the final point where he talks about what Australia is doing. Right? Australia has had a recently released defense strategic review. Obviously, there's been AUKUS. Albanese did not turn the speech into a defense of AUKUS, which he very well could have done given Australia's outreach to Southeast Asia on that defense industrial partnership. But in the end, he did get to China, and he talked about the concerns that a country like Australia has about the possibility of conflict more generally in the region. And he called on the U.S. and China to have dialogues on strategic stability and a military-to-military dialogue. So, I think the line that I think sums up what Albanese was trying to leave the room with was concerning Australia's own military modernization and capability development efforts, which was, and I quote, Australia's goal is not to prepare for war, but to prevent it through deterrence and reassurance and building resilience in the region, doing our part to fulfill the shared responsibility all of us have to preserve peace and security. So that was the case. Overall, I don't think, like I said, it left too much of an impression. But for a fairly new Australian Prime Minister who's already overseen an important defense strategic review and has sustained the predecessor government's AUKUS arrangement, obviously, I think it was a pretty fair and fine keynote overall.
Okay, cool. So I want to kind of,
Not much to say on that, right? Yeah.
no, I don't have much to add, but I do want to get to the point that Albanese made and you just made about small and medium states in the Asia Pacific, and sort of, I think there's a lot to be discussed, possibly in other podcasts as well, but there's a lot to be discussed about the effects of the US-China great power competition on the states that make up the most of Asia, these sort of middle powers. Was there anything interesting that happened in that topic area during the dialogue? You said that most of ASEAN had representatives there, Pacific Island states. Was there attention paid to these states, or is it still seemed a bit of a big power show?
So it's interesting that you bring that up because on Ukraine, certainly we had some interesting moments, right? And of course, I wouldn't call, just to be clear, Indonesia is not a small state. It is certainly
No.
a regional power. But the Indonesian Defense Minister Prabowo made waves, and not in a good way, by presenting a peace plan for Ukraine that the Ukrainian defense minister then later described as basically sounding to him like a Russian plan. It frankly wasn't very serious. I think it did not go over well with many of the Western delegations supportive of Ukraine, who I think broadly interpreted it as part of a pattern of a lack of seriousness by countries like Indonesia that have been non-aligned since the start of the war and have been unwilling to make sort of the tough calls that Western states would like them to make. But I should also be clear here that, Prabowo, for listeners who don't follow Indonesia, he's a political actor. He has political aspirations, and the presentation of this Ukraine peace plan at this prominent international forum, I think, was a way for him to ensure that he got some headlines as a person that is sort of putting Indonesia on the map on these issues. Like I said, it didn't go over well, but Prabowo made no secret of this effectively. I thought, just to kind of go over a couple other points, we also, there was a pretty compelling speech on the implications of climate change for the region from the Fijian defense minister, who basically made the point that, countries like Fiji bear the brunt of this but don't contribute anything to climate change. So how is that fair? And, reminding the forum basically that non-traditional security threats like climate are a huge deal to the region's smaller island states. And that was certainly, I think, welcome and well received. I really liked a moment where Dr. Ung, Singapore's defense minister, who always closes out the summit, he has the final speech as the host. He made a point that military spending is rising in Asia more broadly, and that doesn't necessarily need to lead to instability, but it is a sign that tensions are growing. There's a security dilemma at play, and he called for an effort to pursue a strategic framework of engagement and mutual restraint, and that absent that, we sort of tilt too far towards deterrence and the risk of conflict increases. And that's a very kind of, I think, Singaporean position, obviously. I mean, it's coming from the Singaporean defense minister, but it does take me back to 2019 when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong delivered I thought, a pretty good keynote on how countries like Singapore perceive the great power dynamics and how they often feel caught between and worry about the odds of conflict. And that was a theme that we kept coming back to with several of the other ministers at the dialogue.
I think that's probably a good place to leave it, unless you have any other closing thoughts or reflections on you've been going to these for 5 years, so maybe give us a little view of what's maybe changed, or how your experience has changed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, first of all, like the thing to say, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sure friends and colleagues at the IISS will be listening to this episode, is that I genuinely think that in the current context in Asia, a forum like Shangri-La really does matter, right? There's really nothing else like it in Asia at a moment when dialogue is ultimately necessary. There's a debate in the United States about how much dialogue and engagement can really help in an environment where certain things that China in particular does appear to be deliberately designed to generate risk, like a near collision in the Taiwan Strait or flying near U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, which, by the way, also happened in the hours leading up to the dialogue. But there really is nothing like it, and it's an opportunity to sort of hear from voices that otherwise sometimes are ignored by the major powers. I thought it was particularly prominent that the very first question Secretary Austin got was a question about China's nuclear weapons buildup, but it didn't come from an American or even a Japanese participant. It came from a Philippines participant. The Q&A format is just a really unique way for delegates to put some pretty uncomfortable questions to regional defense ministers. So there's a lot of value. But two things on reflecting on the changes. Thinking back to 2017. Look, I can sort of remember some of the themes that were on the agenda in a big way that year. The Islamic State had taken over Marawi City. North Korea was launching missiles in a way that certainly drew more oxygen than usual at the dialogue. Finally, it was the first year of the Trump administration. And when it came to the U.S.-China agenda, or China and regional security, the things we were talking about were maritime security, whether the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling in the South China Sea would have legs, and on issues like FONOPS, right? It seems a little quaint in the current context of a dialogue like Shangri-La. So a lot has changed, but going forward, it is going to be, I think, limiting if Shangri-La does turn into a forum where, as you said at the outset, Katie, the American Defense Secretary speaks on the first morning, and the Chinese Minister of Defense speaks on the second morning, and both sides simply present competing visions and narratives. I understand, of course, why the conference continues to be anchored around those two morning speeches. I mean, first of all, it gets everybody out of bed and in the rooms to watch the two most anticipated ministers speak. But given the location in Southeast Asia, and as Prime Minister Albanese said, the salience of and the views of these medium and regional states, I think Shangri-La has real value going forward as U.S.-China competition continues to sort of ossify into what it's already become, and as relations continue to remain poor. I think it's going to be really important in what it gives these states to sort of make sure that their views and concerns, and even recommendations for the United States and China, are actually heard. That said, we will continue to see in all likelihood U.S.-China competition continue to really take up a lot of oxygen in the room. Yeah, so it's I think it's an important forum, and yeah, if I get to go back, I'll be happy to continue sort of tracking how these dynamics play out over the years.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Ankit. Thank you very much. And to our listeners, if you haven't already, please leave us a review, recommend us to your friends, and get in touch with Ankit or I on Twitter, via email, however, messenger pigeon, I guess, with topics you'd like to hear us cover. Have a great nap, Ankit.
Thank you, Katie. Great chatting and debriefing on Shangri-La while my thoughts are still hot from the trip. So talk to you soon.
See ya.